All right, so this is gonna be definitely a different style of video that I'm used to doing. Um, but I'm gonna try it out, see how it goes. This is gonna be more of like a rant style video, um, sort of explaining something that I kind of want to talk about. It's kind of hard to make actual popper content since there's going to be bans on Monday and we don't exactly know, or unbans, I guess. We don't know what the changes are going to be. Um, so I thought I would talk a little bit about sideboarding, and in my opinion, sideboard guides are like actively bad. And I think like buying somebody's sideboard guide is like often actively bad for you as a player. And it will actually just make you worse at the game. So I'm gonna try to explain why. I have a couple notes. I don't have like a full script or anything, and I'm definitely not an expert at talking into the camera. But I'll do my best. Also, as you can see, the lighting isn't exactly the best in this room at the moment, but um, it is what it is. So some notes here. But I think the most important thing is that you should know why the cards are in your deck. Like when you go to register your deck for a tournament, you have full control over all the cards you register in your deck and your sideboard. And so, like, you shouldn't just be putting cards in your deck at random. You have control over them. And so you should know why the cards are in your deck and why the cards are in your sideboard and what matchups they should come in and what matchups they should come out. Because knowing those things is a part of choosing the cards for your deck and for your sideboard, right? So if you don't know when cards are supposed to come in and when cards are supposed to come out, then you're not actually informed enough to make accurate deck building decisions. Um, so I think in general, yeah, you should know what you're doing, basically. But I think in general, like treat your deck like a 75. So I see a lot of people will do things like they'll have a deck and it'll be 70, like it'll be 60 cards that's like all trying to be like a linear strategy. So like Burn's a good example. The 60 of the main 60 cards will be like a bunch of lava spikes, a bunch of slow spears, a bunch of, you know, all linear cards. And the sideboard will just be 15 hate cards. It'll be 4 relics, 4 pyroblasts, uh maybe in other formats it'll be like a couple rest in peace. Like it'll just be only hate cards in the sideboard and only linear cards in the main deck. I think that can work for some linear decks. Like I think Burn in Modern does this, where the main deck is all burn spells and the sideboard is often all hate cards. Sometimes they'll play stuff like the uncounterable burn spell, Exquisite Firecraft, which sort of fits with the main game plan, but also sort of a hate card against counter spells. And so even in the most linear decks, you sort of get to this like hybrid approach where you have sideboard cards that do part of the main deck's plan, and main deck cards in a lot of decks will do part of the sideboard plan. So, for example, in the Blue Eye Familiar deck, this is just a random deck list. This is going to be an example for the video. Like these Seagate Oracles, well, maybe it's not the best example, but like Seagate Oracle is partially like a hedge against mono red, and so I can't like not respect mono red at all in my main. I can only respect it in my sideboard, because I'll just lose game one, and then even if I have a bunch of sideboard cards for it, I'm still going to lose to it a decent amount of the time, just because they're going to have blistering fast starts, and I'm going to be on the draw one of the boarded games, and I'm going to die. But there's also this concept where like the marginal utility of um, adding an additional sideboard card for a matchup often goes down the more sideboard cards you add. So, for example, if I have 4 Hydroblasts in my sideboard, adding the fifth Hydroblast is going to give me some equity versus mono red. But going from 0 to 1 Hydroblast, or maybe this is a better example, going from 0 to 4 Hydroblasts is going to give you much more equity than going from 5 to 8 Hydroblasts, just because of how the game works. Like, drawing the first copy of Hydroblast is going to be much more useful than drawing the fourth copy of Hydroblast, um, in basically every scenario. Like maybe there are some sideboard cards that are actually better in multiples. I can't think of any. That's probably a thing that exists. And in those cases, like the marginal utility of the fourth one is actually higher than the first one. But I think for the most part, you get less gains as you add more cards for a specific matchup into your sideboard. And so oftentimes you can get, once you have a decent amount of sideboard cards, I'm going to go into the specifics for familiars because I feel like this is a deck I actually know a decent amount well. Like once you have 5 or 6 sideboard cards in your sideboard for burn, you can't really do much better. Like you can put the 7th and 8th sideboard card in your deck for burn, and I've done this before. I do it all the time. But at that point, what you actually want to do is start putting main deck cards in your deck for burn. And because at that point, you're going to be winning most of the sideboard games, and the best way to get equity against burn is going to be to add mainboard hate cards. And you can't, depending on how the meta is built, sometimes you can actually just main deck Hydroblast. That's a good way to do it. But you'll have to main deck other things. Like Seagate Oracle isn't actually a hate card against Mono Red, like not traditionally, but it is quite good against them. And cards like Prismatic Strands are also good against red. And then another weird thing about Prismatic Strands is that Prismatic Strands, especially today, against the current iterations of Mono Red, Prismatic Strands is actually better in game 1 than it is in the sideboard games, because in the sideboard games, the Mono Red players are pretty likely to bring in Flaring Pain, especially if you have more like 3 or 4 copies of Strands in the 75. They're going to bring in a bunch of Flaring Pains, and your Strands are going to be worse post-board than they are pre-board. So, for example, this is a list I won a challenge with, and I was playing 3 Strands in the sideboard and 1 in the main deck. And this is not a thing you see nowadays in FAMS decks, but the reason that this was good was because at the time, the Mono Red decks were not playing Flaring Pain, and, well, maybe they're playing like 1 or 2, but very rarely were they playing any copies. And they were all in on the Bushwhacker version of the deck. Whereas there was a version of Mono Red recently, not the current version, but another previous version with a Name Sticker Goblin, where Hydroblast suddenly became a card that was actually really good against Mono Red. Hydroblast is obviously at its best when you trade up on mana, so being able to counter the Name Sticker Goblin on turn 3 was like a super big tempo plan that would just win you games. Whereas against the current version of Mono Red, Hydroblast isn't actually that effective against them because their whole deck is basically just 1-drops, with like a couple 2-drops. And so if you just trade 1 for 1 over and over again, like, you know, you're buying time for something. So you can turn these 1 for 1s into value by buying time for your Arcanomancers and Mulldrifters and stuff like that. But, you know, just trading 1 mana Hydroblast with their 1 mana Swiftspear isn't actually that good of an exchange for you. Like, it is a good exchange for you, sort of, but it's not as good as trading 1 mana for 3 mana. And so this sort of gets into another point where, like, the metagame changes so fast that, like, let's say I bought a sideboard guide for Familiars, and the sideboard guide says, oh, you know, Prismatic Strands is the best card against Mono Red deck. They don't run any Flaring Pain, and it's just, they cast their Goblin Bushwhacker, I respond with Prismatic Strands, and it just blows them out and wins the game every time. That's great, but then in 2 weeks, when the Mono Red players swap their deck and they're playing a bunch of Flaring Pains, and they're not playing Bushwhacker anymore, or they're playing the Pinger version, and Prismatic Strands is bad, I then have a sideboard card that's useless to me. Because if I'm not actually thinking about why the cards are in my deck, I'm just going to end up with this piece of paper that tells me to bring in Flaring Pain, and then I'm going to, bring in Prismatic Strands. I'm going to bring in Prismatic Strands, and I'm going to lose, and I'm not going to know why I lost because I didn't actually think critically about why the cards are in my deck. Another thing is that you should be changing how you sideboard based on how your opponent plays, also based on their exact 75, and whether you're on the play or the draw. So, in Familiars, you often on the draw, let's see, there isn't too much sideboarding on the play and the draw, but you do definitely sideboard more or less depending on your opponent's like specific versions of decks. So, like, for example, if I'm playing against a Boros Synthesizer player or a Mono Red player, and I know they have a bunch of red blasts, I'm more likely to want to keep Deep Analysis in my deck post board than I would be otherwise. So the reason behind that is that not only the Deep Analysis lines up well against Pyroblast because you can't counter, like, you need 2 counterspells to counter both sides of Deep Analysis, but also that when the Mono Red players have a bunch of sideboard cards in their deck, they don't kill you as fast, which gives you more time to just play 4-drops in your deck. So it's actually just good for you. If they're playing a bunch of non-linear cards in their deck, the Deep Analysis actually gets better. And I had this sort of interesting discussion on Twitter about this. I think this is pretty interesting. I'm not sure what's correct here, but it's sort of an interesting discussion. I mean, maybe link this in the description if you have thoughts or want to add to this. But let's see, what else do I have? Also, like, knowing what the plan is for a sideboard strategy might be more useful than the actual mapping itself. So, for example, knowing that you want to counter the 3-drop, the Name Sticker Goblin with Hydroblast, and that's what, like, Hydroblast is in your deck to counter Name Sticker Goblin, will change how you play, and might be more useful than the actual mapping of what to take in and what to take out. And then um, another thing about the marginal value. So I was talking about how the marginal value of the fifth Hydroblast is lower than the first Hydroblast because when you draw multiples, they're not as good. Well, there's another factor that is you have to actually take cards out of your deck. So when you, let's say my sideboard for mono red is 4 Hydroblasts and nothing else. Well, I can just take out the 4 worst cards in my deck, right? Let's say, for example, the 4 worst cards are Snap, which maybe they're not going to be, maybe they are. That's fine. I'll take out 4 Snaps, I'll bring in 4 Hydroblast, easy. Okay, let's say I have 8 Hydroblasts, and that's my sideboard. Then it gets way harder, because now I not only have to take out the 4 worst cards, I then have to take out the 8 worst cards, which maybe the next 4 cards are actually good against red. Like, maybe I'm not actually gaining very much, because the marginal, like, I'm not upgrading my cards very much. And so that's where you have to sort of do a calculus where you want to determine what the metagame share is of the decks you're trying to target, how much equity you actually gain from bringing in cards in those matchups. Like there's maybe a matchup like Ponza where Familiars is really bad versus them, but the sideboard cards don't actually gain you very much equity, so you're best off just not playing any sideboard cards for them and just losing if you get paired into them. Let's see what else. I think that's the main concepts I wanted to add. A couple things some people will like ask me or they'll DM me on Discord and be like, hey, can I get help sideboarding in a specific matchup? And I'm more than happy to help people. Like, that's great. I feel honored that you want to ask me how I do something. But I think a lot of times it comes off as like, hey, I just want to like copy your homework. I just want to like cheat off of you and know how you do it so I can win my matches. And I think it comes off a lot better if you say, like, for example, let's say somebody wanted to know how I board Familiars versus Boros Synthesizer. It's a random deck, right? If they were like, hey, I want to know how you board Boros versus Fans versus Boros, if they would like give them as much context as possible. So you could say like, this is the deck list I'm playing, this is the deck list I think my opponent's likely to play, and here's what I would do. Like, here's what I've tried so far, here's why I like this. Like, sort of explain what your main idea is and what you've tried and why you have or haven't liked that. Because then I can be like, yeah, I agree with you, or no, actually I would do this other thing for X reason. And I think that comes off as less like, it comes off as less, oh, I just want to copy your homework, and more like, oh, we want to find out what's actually correct here and sort of like learn. And maybe you can help me learn how to sideboard as well. So yeah, I think that is pretty much all I had. Bit of a rambly video, just a one take video, but yeah, I think that in general, sideboard guides are actively bad. And that if you actually want to win the tournament, you are better off actually knowing what your cards do and thinking about what is actually important in the matchups. And like, you should have played the matchups enough times to know what cards do, when they're good, when they're bad, like all the play patterns. You shouldn't just be copying off of somebody else, because that's not going to actually make you a better player.